Our design challenge for this project was to design a structure and furniture piece that supports growing plants. Our designs were required to be only made from wood and steel sections, and only standard structural connections were allowed. This meant no laser cutting, 3D printing, or any high-tech machinery. I started the design process with research and started with urban farming to see how I could incorporate plants in or around my design. I then looked at geometric shapes and buildings to get some inspiration for my structural design. I started researching some interesting structures and shade structures because I wanted my design to be a shade structure with my furniture piece underneath it. I then looked at different furniture connections to see how furniture can be joined, and then structural connections to see how big structures are joined. Once the research was finished, I then moved to sketch ideation and started making a few small mock-ups to go with it. I started with the geometric shapes to see how I could create these shapes, especially using wooden planks or poles to fit the brief. I then looked at a few different organic types of shade structures and made a few mock-ups to go with it, and then moved on to structural and furniture connections to see exactly how I could make it work, and made a few mock-ups to go with this too. My final chosen direction was inspired by a stretch tent, and I started sketching and making a few mock-ups to see how I could make this organic form of a stretch tent with wooden branding or poles and steel connections. Now that I had my chosen direction, I could really focus on that avenue and started refining my mock-ups. I started making my mock-ups with wooden kebab sticks because I wanted to see how I could create a tent organic type of form with straight wooden poles. I started getting a really good shape and found how I could actually create an organic looking form with these straight poles. I wanted my furniture to be designed in the same style as my structure, and I started using mock-ups to see how I could do this. And I started developing a nice form that was inspired by my structure, but I then had to develop this form and manipulate it quite a bit so that it actually could be used as a functional bench. Through the process, I had finally developed my final structure design. My design used wooden beams and steel connections to create a shade structure that actually creates a trellis for vines and plants to grow up and actually create the shade themselves. The design is inspired by a stretch tent, and I really managed to get that organic stretch tent look that I was going for. My final furniture design was inspired by my structure design, but I had to manipulate it a bit to create a functioning furniture piece. It is a lounging type bench that students can go and relax on and read a book. Each wooden beam connects to a steel T-piece at the bottom, and it has trellising on the sides for the plants to grow up, just like the structural design. My structure was designed with thick steel base plates to be bolted into the ground and secured. The outer beams are 75mm beams and the cross members are 50mm beams. Each crossbeam has a steel plate connected to it that then connects to a steel bracket that is mounted to the main beams. These two connections are then secured with a nut and bolt. As you can see here, this is how vines will grow up the trellising of the structure and actually create the shade. And here's an example of it being used at a university. My final furniture design sits 2 to 4 people and has an armrest in the middle. It's designed so that people can either face each other and have a chat or relax and take a break from work and read a book. Here you can see how the vines and plants would grow up the trellis just like the structure. My furniture prototype was built at a 1:2 scale. My structure prototype was built at a 1:5 scale. For both of my prototypes, I really succeeded in creating the exact form that I developed through my design. I then used some vines to demonstrate on the actual prototype how this prototype would be used in real life and how the plants would actually create the shade.